Chapter 1. The storm's gift. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight, turning the Wyoming Territory into a frozen wasteland that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the world. Jacob Whitmore pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders as he trudged through the knee-deep snow, his boots crunching against the frozen ground with each labored step. The wind howled like a wounded animal, carrying ice crystals that stung his weathered face and made his eyes watered at 42. Jacob had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical. His ranch, nestled in a valley between two peaks, had been his sanctuary for the past 15 years. It was a place where he could escape the ghosts of his past and find solace in the simple rhythm of caring for his cattle and horses. The isolation suited him perfectly, or so he told himself during the long, lonely nights when sleep refused to come. He was making his way back to the main house after checking on his livestock in the barn when something caught his eye. At first he thought it was just another snowdrift, but as he looked closer, he noticed something odd about the shape. There was a patch of dark fabric protruding from the white blanket that covered the ground near his fence line. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He quickened his pace, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he approached the spot. With his gloved hands, he began to carefully brush away the snow, his movements becoming more urgent with each passing second. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. It was a young woman, probably no more than 20, curled up in a fetal position beneath the snow. Her lips were blue, and her dark hair was frozen to her pale cheeks. She wore a tattered dress that had once been blue but was now stained with mud and torn in several places. Her feet were bare, and Jacob could see that her toes were beginning to show signs of frostbite. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, immediately dropping to his knees beside her. He pressed his ear to her chest, listening desperately for any sign of life. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own racing heartbeat. Then, faint as a whisper, he heard a weak, irregular rhythm that told him she was still alive, but barely. Without wasting another second, Jacob scooped the girl into his arms. She was surprisingly light, as if the cold had somehow drained the very substance from her bones. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel how cold her skin was even through his thick coat. The journey back to his house felt like an eternity. Each step was a battle against the wind and snow, and Jacob found himself talking to the unconscious girl as if his voice alone could keep her tethered to life. "Stay with me now," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Don't you dare give up on me. We're almost there." The warmth of his house hit him like a wave as he kicked open the front door. The fire in the hearth was still burning, casting dancing shadows across the simple but comfortable interior. Jacob carried the girl to his bedroom, the only room in the house that stayed consistently warm, and gently laid her on his bed. He worked quickly, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with emergencies before. First, he removed her wet frozen clothes, trying to maintain her dignity while assessing the extent of her condition. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch, and he could see the telltale signs of hypothermia in her sluggish pulse and shallow breathing. Jacob grabbed every blanket he could find and wrapped them around her, then built up the fire until the room was almost uncomfortably warm. He heated water on the stove and filled several bottles, placing them carefully around her body to help restore her core temperature. Then he sat beside the bed, watching her face for any sign of improvement. As the hours passed, Jacob found himself studying her features. She had high cheekbones and a delicate jawline that spoke of gentle breeding, not the hard life of a frontier woman. Her hands, though cold and pale, were soft and unblemished by manual labor. Everything about her suggested that she came from a world very different from his own. "Who are you?" he whispered to the still form on his bed. "And what in God's name were you doing out there in the storm?" As if in response to his question, the girl's eyelids fluttered. Jacob leaned forward, his heart pounding with anticipation. Slowly, her eyes opened, revealing irises the color of spring grass. For a moment, she stared at him with confusion and fear, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room. "Easy now," Jacob said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe. I found you in the snow, and I brought you here to warm up. You're going to be all right." The girl tried to sit up, but Jacob gently pressed her back down. "You need to rest. You were nearly frozen to death out there. What's your name?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She tried again, her voice barely a whisper. I done, single quotes T. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head frantically. I don't remember anything." Jacob felt his heart clench at the desperation in her voice. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes the cold can do that to a person. Your memory will come back. Just give it time." But as the girl continued to stare at him with those lost, frightened eyes, Jacob began to suspect that her memory loss might be about more than just the cold. There was something haunted in her expression, a shadow that spoke of trauma that ran deeper than physical injury. "What should I call you?" he asked, settling back in his chair beside the bed. The girl's lower lip trembled. "I don't know. I can't remember my name. I can't remember anything about myself." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, watching as tears slipped down her cheeks. Then, surprising himself, He reached out and gently wiped them away with his thumb. "Well," he said softly, "everyone needs a name. How about we call you Grace? It seems fitting, considering you're alive by the grace of God." Grace looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. "Grace," she repeated, testing the name on her lips. "I like that." "Thank you, Jacob," he said, pointing to himself. "Jacob Whitmore, and you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to, at least until the storm passes and you remember where you belong." But even as he said the words, Jacob found himself hoping that Grace's memory would take its time returning. For the first time in 15 years, his house didn't feel quite so empty. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Snow. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine white snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning. Grace had been awake for most of the previous day, though she remained weak and stayed close to the fire. Jacob had been the perfect gentleman, sleeping on the couch and bringing her meals while she recovered her strength. Grace sat by the window wrapped in one of Jacob's wool blankets, watching him work in the yard. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his entire life working with his hands, shoveling paths through the snow and checking on his animals. She found herself drawn to his quiet strength and the gentle way he had cared for her, never asking probing questions about her past even though she could see the curiosity in his eyes. "The coffee's ready," Jacob said as he stamped his boots on the porch before entering the house. His cheeks were red from the cold, and there were snowflakes caught in his dark hair, which was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples. "Thank you," Grace said, accepting the warm mug with grateful hands. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the delicate tea she somehow remembered preferring, though she couldn't recall where or when she had developed that preference. Jacob settled into the chair across from her, his own mug steaming in his hands. "Feeling any better today?" Grace nodded, though she could see the concern in his brown eyes. "My body feels stronger, but my mind, .. She trailed off, pressing her fingers to her temples. "It's like trying to see through fog. I get glimpses of things, a woman's voice, the smell of roses, the sound of a piano, but nothing clear, nothing that makes sense." "Maybe that's for the best," Jacob said quietly. "Sometimes the mind protects us from things we're not ready to face." There was something in his tone that made Grace look at him more closely. "You sound like you speak from experience." Jacob's jaw tightened slightly, and he stared into his coffee for a long moment. "We all have things we'd rather forget," he said finally. "The difference is, most of us don't get the luxury of actually forgetting them." Grace sensed there was a story behind his words, but she didn't push. Instead, she changed the subject. "I should probably try to find out who I am. There must be people looking for me." "Maybe," Jacob agreed, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "But winter's got this place pretty well cut off from the outside world. The nearest town is Millbrook, about 15 miles south, but the roads won't be passable for at least another week, maybe 2. Grace nodded, though she found herself oddly relieved by the news. The thought of leaving this warm, safe house and venturing back into the world filled her with a nameless dread. Whatever life she had been living before Jacob found her, she had a feeling it hadn't been a happy one. In the meantime, Jacob continued, "You're welcome to stay here. I've got plenty of room, and to be honest, it's nice having someone to talk to. Gets pretty quiet out here during the winter months." "I don't want to be a burden," Grace said. Jacob's expression softened. "You're not a burden. If anything, you're doing me a favor. I'd forgotten how much I missed having someone to cook for." As if to prove his point, Jacob spent the afternoon preparing an elaborate meal. Grace watched from the kitchen table, marveling at the easy way he moved around the kitchen. He told her stories about his ranch, about the cattle he raised and the horses he trained, and for the first time since she had awakened, Grace felt herself truly relaxing. "You're a good cook," she said, as they sat down to a dinner of roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables from his root cellar. "Had to learn," Jacob replied. "Can't survive out here without knowing how to take care of yourself." "Have you always lived alone?" Grace asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw the shadow that crossed his face. "Not always," Jacob said quietly. "I was married once. My wife's name was Sarah. She died in childbirth 8 years ago, along with our son." Grace felt her heart break for him. "I'm so sorry." Jacob nodded, his eyes distant. "Sarah was everything good in this world. Kind, gentle, always saw the best in people. She would have liked you." "What makes you say that?" "She had a soft spot for lost souls," Jacob said with a sad smile. "Always bringing home stray animals, taking in anyone who needed help. She would have fussed over you something fierce." Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Jacob said, then seemed to shake himself out of his melancholy. "But that's enough talk about the past. What about you? Any memories coming back?" Grace frowned, pressing her fingers to her temples again. "Just fragments. I keep seeing a man's face, but I can't make out his features, and I have this feeling like I was running from something, or someone." Jacob's expression grew serious. "What kind of feeling?" "Fear," Grace said simply. "Pure, bone-deep terror. Whatever I was running from, I was willing to die rather than face it." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Well, he said finally, whatever it was, it can't reach you here. You're safe now. But even as he said the words, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Grace's past would catch up with her eventually, and when it did, he wasn't sure he would be strong enough to let her go. That night, Grace woke to the sound of crying. For a moment, she thought it was her own voice, but then she realized the sound was coming from the living room. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and padded barefoot across the cold floor, finding Jacob sitting in his chair by the dying fire, his head in his hands. "Jacob," she whispered. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "I'm sorry, did I wake you?" Grace shook her head and settled into the chair beside him. "Bad dreams." "Something like that," Jacob said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Some nights are harder than others. Tonight would have been my son's 8th birthday. Grace felt tears spring to her own eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and pulled Jacob into her arms, holding him while he grieved for the family he had lost. In that moment, she understood that they were both refugees from their pasts, both seeking solace in the temporary sanctuary they had found together. "I'm sorry," Jacob said when he finally pulled away. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Grace said firmly. "We all need someone to hold us sometimes." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace saw something shift in his expression. "Grace," he said softly, "I need to tell you something. When I found you in the snow, you were wearing this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold wedding ring, simple but elegant. Grace stared at it as if it were a snake. "I'm married," she whispered, the words feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. "Maybe," Jacob said. "Or maybe you were—" "The ring was loose on your finger, like you'd lost weight recently. And there's something else." He hesitated, then continued. "There are bruises on your wrists and arms. Old ones, mostly healed, but they're there." Grace looked down at her arms, and now that he mentioned it, she could see the faint yellow-green marks that indicated healing bruises. "Someone hurt me," she said, and it wasn't a question. Jacob nodded grimly. "That's what I'm thinking. And I suspect that whoever it was, they're the reason you ended up alone in a blizzard." Grace stared at the ring in Jacob's palm, and suddenly she didn't want to remember anymore. Whatever life she had been living, whatever had driven her to walk into a deadly storm, she didn't want it back. She wanted to stay here, in this warm house with this kind man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. "Keep it," she said, pushing Jacob's hand away. "I don't want it." "Grace, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to remember. I don't want to be whoever I was before. Can't I just be Grace? Can't I just be the woman you found in the snow?" Jacob studied her face for a long moment, then slowly closed his fingers around the ring. "For now," he said quietly, "but someday, your past is going to come calling. And when it does, we'll face it together." Grace nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that when that day came, it would destroy the fragile peace they had found together. Chapter 3. The Name That Matters. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and Grace had settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. She woke each morning to the sound of Jacob moving around the kitchen, preparing coffee and breakfast before heading out to tend to his animals. By the time he returned, she would have tidied the house and started preparing lunch, moving through the domestic tasks with a familiarity that surprised her. "You're a natural at this," Jacob observed one afternoon as he found her mending one of his shirts by the window. The winter light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and Jacob found himself pausing to admire the peaceful picture she made. Grace looked up from her sewing and smiled. "It feels right, somehow, like this is what I was meant to do." "Maybe it is," Jacob said, settling into the chair across from her. "Not everyone is cut out for frontier life, but you've taken to it like you were born to it." "I keep thinking about what you said," Grace said, setting down her needle. "About my past? Coming to find me. What if I don't want to be found?" Jacob's expression grew serious. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I just stayed here? What if I became someone new?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know it sounds crazy, but I feel more like myself here, with you, than I think I ever have in my life." Jacob felt his heart skip a beat, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Grace, you can't just disappear from your old life. There are people who—" "Are there?" Grace interrupted. "If someone cared about me, wouldn't they have come looking by now? Wouldn't there be search parties, people asking questions in town?" Jacob had been wondering the same thing himself. In his experience, when someone went missing in this part of the country, word spread quickly. The fact that no one had come looking for Grace suggested that either her disappearance hadn't been noticed, or the people who might have noticed weren't the kind to involve the law. "Maybe they think you're dead," Jacob said gently. "You nearly were when I found you." Grace shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I can almost hear his voice. Angry, threatening, and I know, somehow, that I ran because I had to, because staying would have meant—" She trailed off. Unable to finish the thought, Jacob reached across the space between them and took her hand. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Grace looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, struggling with how to answer. The truth was, he had fallen in love. With her, not just with her beauty, though she was undeniably lovely, but with her gentle spirit, her quiet strength, and the way she had brought warmth and life back into his empty house. But he couldn't tell her that, not when she was still so vulnerable, still so lost. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because I care about you." Grace studied his face, and Jacob had the feeling she could see right through him. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "More than I should, considering ... Considering what?" Grace pulled her hand away and stood up, walking to the window. "Considering that I might be married to someone else, considering that I might have children somewhere, wondering where their mother has gone." Jacob joined her at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the soap she used in her hair. "Do you think you have children?" Grace placed her hand on her stomach, a gesture that seemed unconscious. "I don't think so. I feel like I would remember something that important." "But the ring," she trailed off, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "The ring could mean anything," Jacob said. "Maybe you were married and your husband died. Maybe you were engaged and changed your mind. Maybe you were wearing it to protect yourself from unwanted advances." Grace turned to look at him, hope flickering in her green eyes. "Do you really think so?" "I think," Jacob said carefully, "that you're here now, and whatever brought you here, I'm grateful for it." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall outside. Then Grace spoke again, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear her. "Jacob, there's something I need to tell you. Last night, I remembered something, a name." Jacob's heart clenched. "What name?" "Elizabeth," Grace said, and the name seemed to hang in the air between them. "My name is Elizabeth. Elizabeth Hartwell." Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Hartwell," he repeated. "That name sounds familiar." Grace nodded, her face pale. I think I remember why. My husband is Charles Hartwell. He owns the biggest cattle ranch in Colorado Territory. And he's not a good man, Jacob. He's cruel and violent. And when he drinks, ... double quotes, she shuddered. I think I left him. I think I finally found the courage to... Jacob absorbed this information, his mind racing. The Hartwell name was indeed familiar. Charles Hartwell was known throughout the territory as a man who got what he wanted, no matter the cost. He had a reputation for ruthlessness in business, and, according to rumors, in his personal life as well. If you're Elizabeth Hartwell, Jacob said slowly, then you're not just running from a violent husband. You're running from one of the most powerful men in the territory. Grace Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, and if he finds me, he'll kill me. He told me once that if I ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure I never left him again. I believe him. Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. He won't find you, he said fiercely. I won't let him. You don't understand, Elizabeth, said her voice muffled against his chest. Charles has men everywhere. He has connections, influence. It's only a matter of time before... No, Jacob interrupted, pulling back to look at her face. You're not Elizabeth Hartwell anymore. You're Grace. You're the woman I found in the snow, the woman who chose to start over. Elizabeth Hartwell died in that blizzard. Grace lives here now. Elizabeth stared at him, her eyes wide. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to disappear, I'll help you. We'll burn that dress you were wearing. Destroy any evidence that you were ever here. As far as the world is concerned, you're Grace Whitmore. Elizabeth whispered. Jacob's face reddened slightly. I know it's not proper, but if anyone asks, you're my wife. It's the only way to protect you. A single woman draws too much attention, but a rancher's wife? He shrugged. No one would question it. Elizabeth felt her heart pounding. Are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to let me protect you, Jacob said, in whatever way is necessary. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. This man, who had saved her life and was now offering to save her future. She thought about the life she had been living as Elizabeth Hartwell, the fear and pain and hopelessness. Then she thought about the past 2 weeks, the peace she had found in this simple house with this good man. Yes, she said simply. I'll be Grace Whitmore. Jacob's face broke into a smile, and he kissed her forehead gently. Then Grace Whitmore, you shall be. As they held each other in the fading afternoon light, neither of them noticed the rider watching from the tree line, or the way he turned his horse and disappeared into the forest, carrying news that would change everything. Chapter 4. A Name Worth Fighting. Fourth wedding was simple. Held 3 days later in the parlor of the Millbrook Church, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Grace wore a blue dress that Jacob had bought for her in town, and she carried a small bouquet of winter berries that she had picked herself. Jacob wore his best suit, the one he had worn to Sarah's funeral 8 years ago, and for the first time since then, he felt like he had a reason to hope for the future. Do you, Jacob Whitmore, take Grace to be your lawfully wedded wife? The preacher asked. I do, Jacob said, his voice steady and sure. And do you, Grace, take Jacob to be your lawfully wedded husband? Grace looked into Jacob's eyes, seeing the love and protection he offered, and felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't known was possible. I do. When Jacob kissed her at the end of the ceremony, Grace felt like she was truly being born for the first time. Elizabeth Hartwell was gone, buried beneath the snow, along with all the pain and fear of her former life. Grace Whitmore was real, solid, and protected by a man who would die before he let anyone hurt her. They spent their wedding night in the hotel in Millbrook, and for the first time in her memory, Grace felt safe enough to give herself completely to another person. Jacob was gentle and patient, treating her like something precious, and when she cried afterward, he held her until the tears stopped. "What's wrong?" he asked softly, stroking her hair. "Nothing," Grace whispered. "For the first time in my life, nothing is wrong." They returned to the ranch the next morning, and Grace threw herself into the role of rancher's wife with enthusiasm. She learned to milk the cows, to collect eggs from the chickens, and to help Jacob with the horses. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Grace mending clothes or reading while Jacob worked on his account books or repaired tack. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and Grace had never been happier. The happiness lasted exactly 2 weeks. Grace was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked up to see a group of 6 men riding toward the house, their leader mounted on a magnificent black stallion. Even from a distance, she could see the expensive cut of his clothes and the arrogant set of his shoulders. Her blood turned to ice. She knew that silhouette, had lived in fear of it for 3 years. Charles Hartwell had found her. "Jacob," she called, her voice cracking with terror. "Jacob, come quickly." Jacob emerged from the barn, took one look at the approaching riders, and immediately went to Grace's side. "Get in the house," he said quietly. "Lock the doors and don't come out, no matter what happens." "I can't let you face him alone," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "You can, and you will," Jacob said firmly. "I'm your husband now, and I'll protect you, trust me." Grace wanted to argue, but the sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. She ran to the house, watching from the window as the riders approached. Jacob stood in the yard, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip, his posture relaxed but alert. Charles Hartwell dismounted from his horse, his pale blue eyes scanning the property with the calculating gaze of a man who was used to taking what he wanted. He was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair, and a face that would have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth. "Mr. Whitmore, I presume?" Charles said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of an educated man. "I'm Charles Hartwell. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jacob replied evenly. Charles smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My wife, Mr. Whitmore, she's been missing for nearly a month now. I've been searching for her, and my men tracked her to this area. Imagine my surprise when I learned that you recently married a woman named Grace who fits my wife's description perfectly." "My wife's name is Grace Whitmore," Jacob said. "She's been with me for years, has she now?" Charles's smile widened. "Then you won't mind if I see her?" "Just to clear up any confusion." Jacob's jaw tightened. "My wife is resting. She's not receiving visitors." "I'm afraid I must insist," Charles said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You see, Mr. Whitmore, I have legal documents that say Elizabeth Hartwell is my wife, and if you're harboring her, that makes you guilty of kidnapping." From inside the house, Grace watched the confrontation with growing terror. She could see the tension in Jacob's shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his gun. Charles's men had spread out, surrounding the house, and she realized with dawning horror that Jacob was outnumbered 6-1. "There's no Elizabeth here," Jacob said, "just my wife Grace." Charles's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to count to 3. If my wife doesn't come out of that house, my men are going to go in and get her, and if anyone tries to stop them, well, accidents happen." 1. Jacob's hand moved closer to his gun. 2. Grace couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't let Jacob die for her. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, her chin raised defiantly. "Hello, Charles," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Charles's face lit up with triumph. "Elizabeth, my dear, you've led me quite a chase." "My name is Grace Whitmore," she said firmly. "Elizabeth Hartwell is dead." Charles laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't be ridiculous. You're my wife, and you're coming home with me." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Grace said. "I'm married to Jacob now, legally married. Whatever claim you had on me is gone." "Bigamy is illegal, my dear," Charles said, his voice dangerously soft. "Your marriage to this man is invalid. You're still mine." Jacob stepped forward, his hand now resting on his gun. "She's not going anywhere with you, Hartwell. Not now. Not ever." Charles's expression turned ugly. "You think you can steal my wife and get away with it? You think hiding behind some fake ceremony will protect you? I think," Jacob said quietly, "that you need to get off my land. Now." Charles gestured to his men, and they began to advance. Jacob drew his gun with lightning speed, but he was still outnumbered. Grace watched in horror as the situation spiraled toward violence. "Stop," she cried, stepping between Jacob and Charles. "I'll go with you, Charles. Just don't hurt him, Grace." "No," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "I won't let you die for me," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "I won't." Charles smiled triumphantly. "Very wise, my dear. Get your things." "We're leaving?" Grace nodded, started to turn toward the house, then suddenly spun back around. Actually, Charles, I've changed my mind. I'd rather die than go back to you. Before anyone could react, Grace lunged for Jacob's gun. The weapon discharged. As they struggled for it, and Charles Hartwell fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder, "You shot me?" he gasped in disbelief. "I defended myself," Grace said, her voice deadly calm, "against a man who was threatening my husband and trying to kidnap me." Jacob quickly regained control of his gun, leveling it at Charles's men. "I suggest you take your boss and leave. Now." Charles's foreman, a grizzled man named Pete, looked at his wounded employer and then at Jacob's steady aim. "This ain't over, Whitmore." "Yes, it is," Jacob said. "Grace Whitmore is my wife. She's under my protection now, and if any of you come back here, I'll be ready." As Charles's men helped him onto his horse, he looked back at Grace with hatred, burning in his eyes. "You can't hide forever, Elizabeth. I'll find a way to get you back." "My name is Grace Whitmore," she said one final time, "and I'm exactly where I belong." After the men had ridden away, Jacob and Grace stood in the yard, holding each other tightly. They both knew that Charles wouldn't give up easily, that there would be other confrontations, other attempts to reclaim what he considered his property, but they also knew that they had something Charles would never understand. A love built on respect, protection, and the choice to stand together against whatever came their way. "Are you sure about this?" Jacob asked, stroking Grace's hair. "It's not going to be easy. He'll keep coming." Grace pulled back to look at him, her green eyes fierce with determination. "I'm sure you gave me your name, Jacob. You gave me a chance to be someone new, and I'll fight for that chance. For us, for as long as I live." Jacob kissed her then, long and deep, and in that kiss was a promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Grace Whitmore had been born in a blizzard, shaped by love, and forged by fire, and she was stronger than anyone, including Charles Hartwell, could ever imagine. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, Grace looked up at the vast Wyoming sky and felt truly free for the first time in her life. She had found her name, her home, and her place in the world, and she would never let anyone take them away from her again. The lonely rancher had found a girl buried in snow, and in saving her, he had saved himself. Together, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of their broken pasts. And together, they would defend it with everything they had. Grace Whitmore was no longer lost. She was found, she was loved, and she was home. The end.